Hello, this is the first of these videos where we're going to be talking about things to do with the video game Fights in Tight Spaces, and we thought we would record something discussing how the game was signed, how it was pitched, in case that helps any of you out there who might be trying to pitch and sign a game. So my name is Paul from Mode 7, and in the other window over there...
It's me, it's James Parker. I'm the director over at Ground Shatter, who's developing the game.
Marvellous. So let's talk about first where the game originated when you first had the idea. I think you DM'd me about it in 2018. Is that correct?
Yes, I found that DM the other day. Well, we can probably show that. I'd had an idea a bit before that. I'd been reading a book, watching a film, which had that classic action movie thing that the hero was being transported in the back of a car by some bad guys and managed to make their way out of that situation by attacking all the other people who were in the car and eventually get themselves out of that situation. And it got me thinking about that trope in films and TV and things, and how it hadn't really been tackled as a game yet. And I got into this thing of thinking about how you could kind of replicate that in a video game. But the most natural way of doing that was like a series of quick time events, which is not what anybody wants. And it certainly creates a very specific style of gameplay, which I didn't necessarily want to do. So we spent a bit of time, Connie, who makes our videos, I got her to go and kind of clip out from films, places where people were having fights in cars and backs of vans or helicopters or like all these varieties of kind of confined spaces. And I think at that stage, I already had the name of the game because Fights in Tight Spaces kind of came so naturally to that. And it kind of percolated around in my head a bit as these ideas tend to. And I've been playing a lot of Into the Breach. And probably by that point, I've been playing a bit of Slay the Spire. So I had all of these kind of ideas in my head for more kind of tactical games than we've been doing. And I think at that point we were very close to the end of finishing Rico, which was our last title, which was a first-person shooter, and that was quite a big title for us. It was a small team, but we were making a game for multiple platforms. We had online and offline co-op play, so we wanted to do something a bit more straightforward and mechanic-y and rules-based. So something tactical like Into the Breach was kind of at the forefront of my mind, something that would be a kind of a bit of a different project for the team, so they could stop worrying about kind of very high performance things and all this online latency issues and all of those normal things that you get with a first-person shooter, and do something completely different to that. And I think eventually they kind of, all of these different influences and ideas coalesced together into the idea that you could make a fighting game that was also about controlling the space and was just very much the idea that you were an action hero, but you didn't have to do everything in real time, but you were making the same sorts of decisions as they were, and then it was playing out as if it were an action film.
Yeah, I think people really like that idea of being able to project themselves into the situation and say, you know, what would I do? Like, because it's that sort of shouting at the screen thing of, you know, you want a character to do a specific thing, or you're amazed that they managed to both hit the person behind them and then jump in the air and kick someone else simultaneously. So I think does that happen to you a lot with design? Like you kind of have a very specific sort of scene or kind of emotion that you want to convey, and then you go outside to like external things and say, oh, this could be turn-based, this could be deck building.
Yeah, I think so. I think generally with any kind of creative stuff that I'm doing, it never comes out fully formed. You never go, right, I'm going to do this one thing, I know exactly what it is, boom, let's go. For me, it starts as a series of influences and ideas, and you kind of have an idea of what you want to convey, and then your game designery bit takes over and goes, well, how is this going to be mechanically interesting, and how is this going to be there's a kind of production part of you that goes, well, actually, how are we going to practically do this as well? And those things then start to re-influence the idea. So it goes from can we make a game about having a fight in the back of a car? Well, actually, that's going to be a bit limiting. What if we expand that out, but only slightly, so that you're having fights in lifts and bathrooms, and it gives you a play space that is slightly more flexible and varied, but while keeping the kind of spirit of the original idea alive.
Right. Yeah. So it kind of adds that context, and that framework kind of can come into expand the horizons of that original idea a little bit, I guess.
Yeah.
So could maybe we should talk about pitching, because I think in some ways this has some quite standard elements to it, and in others it is a little bit unconventional. So when you came to sort of start thinking about pitching the game around, how did you synthesize that into the thing that you sent to me, and the thing that you're going to send externally?
Yeah. So the point at which it was an idea that I felt I could kind of start teasing people with, I suppose. That's when I sent you a message saying, we've got this idea for a game. It's Into the Breach meets a Jason Statham film, which was kind of all there was and all there is to some extent now. But that was, I thought that at that point there was enough to give people an impression of what ultimately was going to be. But that's not generally enough to get a game signed.
Yeah.
So between then and when I actually pitched it to you, we had taken a bunch of assets from Rico and created a mock-up kind of bathroom fight between a bunch of characters from the game, just to it was like a mood piece, I suppose, and you kind of, if you watch that now, then it's got some similarities with the game as it stands, because I knew ultimately what I wanted fights to be. I could kind of direct it and say, right, everyone has to move in turn, but it also has to flow and kind of give the impression that this is a sequence that the player could have thought through and actually executed.
Yeah.
So we had that, and a very kind of short pitch document that showed all of those different influences.
Yeah, and for me, sort of getting that the previs was hugely helpful in me seeing kind of what the gameplay would eventually be like, because the previs itself with those Rico assets, it kind of just read as a nice sort of isometric-y tactical game. So I could just look at that and I could put it into that box, which is what publishers love to do. I go, oh, it's one of those. And then from there you can go, oh, okay, this is about choosing your moves in a fight. And I think that fundamental idea is really, really compelling. And then it was interesting to me that you'd gone for pure turn-based, as opposed to simultaneous turn-based or real time with pause, which I think would be, obviously John Wick has its own kind of simultaneous turn-based type of thing that they sort of very cleverly innovated on standard ways of doing simultaneous turn-based. What made you kind of go that route? Because I felt like that was something you had to sell with that initial pitch as well.
Yeah, I think probably for me it was one of the nice things about Into the Breach, and I will probably keep going back to that all the time, is that it's that idea of complete information. The fact that when you're presented with a turn, it is a puzzle that you can potentially solve yourself at any point, because you know exactly what everyone's going to do, what the consequences of every action you're going to take are going to be within that turn. And then it's between turns that the situation changes, and then you regain or re-lose control of that situation yourself. And I thought that is a more action hero-y thing,
yeah,
in terms of what we were trying to convey, than the fact that stuff could change midway through that thought process. There's that bit in the first Robert Downey Jr.'s Sherlock Holmes where he kind of works through the fight in his head in advance, and then it plays out as he's predicted, and that's kind of what I feel like every action hero is always doing. They're like, I'm going to punch that guy through this thing, I'm going to kick that guy through this thing, and then I'm going to come out unscathed, and then something else will change and I have to react to those things, rather than the kind of messiness of everything happening at the same time, even in a a simultaneous turn-based kind of way.
That's true, actually, because in a lot of those scenes, the kind of grammar is, yeah, they do a sequence, and then there'll be a shot of them. They'll react to a new person jumping through a window, or some new event, and then it will be on to this next sequence. So you actually, but yeah, it's interesting to contrast this with something like Torrid Bash. I don't know if you've played that game or seen that. That was kind of an old game, like 2005, 2006, and that is kind of, you are changing your moves mid-move. It's a physics-based dueling game.
Yeah.
If people haven't played, it's actually really interesting game design, and people should look at it. But that has this very fluid, kind of dynamic, reactive space with characters kind of physicsing everywhere. And I was glad that you had gone for pure turn-based in the pitch, because having worked on 3 simultaneous turn-based games, I kind of know the limitations of that mode, and there are so many things that you have to take into account. One of them is this thing to do with, there's this kind of debt that you have to pay to your future self in order to make any decisions in a simultaneous turn-based game. So you can't just say, I'm going to do this, this, this. You have to go, I'm going to do this, they're going to do that, I'm going to do this, they're going to do that, and then you kind of unspool it. So it's much harder to take a turn sometimes in a simultaneous turn-based game in terms of cognitive load. Whereas with this, if there's a person standing in front of you and you can punch them, and then you can move on to the next step of your sequence, you're not going, oh, they're going to punch me back, so I have to. So you can actually just go bang, 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 and that has a more satisfying feeling to it, I think. And again, that was what your previous kind of showed, that it's like, I can do this, this, this.
Yeah, I think weirdly the fact that it is kind of entirely turn-based makes it slightly higher paced as well, because you're not, like you're saying, you're not going through that process of second guessing everyone's reactions to what you do kind of constantly. You can, and also the fact that it's card-based, that was something I wanted to have, that card-based deck building element from quite early on, with the requirement to make that more kind of fluid over longer term. That is kind of interrupts the purity of having a hand of cards that you can then manipulate, play and retain cards from, or whatever, that kind of, you lose some of the importance of having hands and having a discard pile and a draw pile and all those kind of classic card game elements.
Right, yeah, and the cards, sort of, we haven't even talked that much about them yet, but sort of seeing that come in as an element, that was one of, I think, probably the most unique thing about the game, was combining that Into the Breach style thing with deck building and cards, and kind of, I felt like it had quite a clear route to the deck building, even from that concept, because it's your selection of moves is your hand, and that felt like quite a natural concept. Whereas I think deck building in a lot of other games can get quite abstracted to kind of secondary things that combine together and all sorts of things. Whereas this is like, it's clear how you could do that potentially.
Yeah, it took a little while in the original thought process to get it to that stage, but now there's a really clear balance for the player between the kind of choice of cards, or the luck of the draw as they get for their hand, the amount of energy they've got remaining, and then the most crucial element, which doesn't exist in other similar deck building games, which is their spacing and their positioning on the board. So we have a lot of cards that are purely about positioning, and that is kind of one of the strengths of the game, is that it is just as powerful sometimes to step back from a fight than it is to lay into someone with a big kick or whatever, because you know that next turn you're going to be able to do something a lot more elaborate and deal with more enemies at once. So it's that kind of affords us a lot more opportunity space for the player to make interesting decisions.
Yeah,
but without necessarily really expanding out in kind of multiple levels of metagame stuff, which the games like Slay the Spire and Pirates Outlaws do, which is kind of by necessity, because you're limited so much in terms of you are on one side of the screen and the enemies are on the other, and your only interactions are attack or defend.
Yeah. Let's kind of go a bit more granular now into the actual pitching, signing process, because I think people generally want to know about that sort of how to pitch a game. And I think a really big factor in this game particularly was the fact that we have known each other for years. I've seen your work, and I've kind of seen your progression through from when you started, and again, kind of similarly with me. And also, there was, I mean, I presume you're okay talking about this. Like, you did show me Rico kind of early on,
Yeah.
and that wasn't something that we were able to do at the time. But I was kind of, I was impressed by that, and I thought it was an interesting idea. And I could never quite put it together in my head of sort of how, Mode 7 would be able to kind of structure a good release for that game, and sort of budget and so on. So I think that's kind of an interesting example of, people often think if they pitch, and it's not successful, it's a disaster, or the publisher hated their game, or they did something wrong. But actually, in that instance, it was really helpful for me, especially as that game came out and did well. And then he'd think, I could have done that. That always helps. So it's sort of psychologically with kind of making the decision. Was your decision to sort of pitch to me kind of influenced by that stuff at all, or were you just trying to get it signed?
No, definitely. I think so. There was a number of factors, and obviously it's a poor tip for anyone who's kind of starting out, who's not been around for a long time, but kind of knowing you for probably 10 years
Yeah.
was immediately
Well,
and obviously a
I
really
don't.
useful way
Yeah,
into starting those
I don't think
discussions.
that is a poor tip, because I think people assume that kind of everything is done through this sort of almost objective network of evaluations of pitches and so on. But actually having a relationship with someone and knowing that they're a person that you can trust because you're going to be in the thick of a difficult thing with them, that's something that people think that publishing, because it's product investment, is kind of very one and done. Like, you just pay someone and then they do a thing and then you make money and you move on to the next thing. But it's every single publishing project I've done has had like massive road bumps and disasters and problems and issues all the way through. And just as with an equity investment, that you need to be kind of, you need to trust that person to sort of be in the trenches with them. So that's sort of your expectation going in. And when things kind of go smoothly, as they have largely with this, that's just like a wonderful surprise.
Mm.
But you need to be able to trust that person to when a problem inevitably happens, or development goes in a direction that doesn't work, you have to be able to work that out together.
Yeah, absolutely, and that obviously goes both ways. And I think back to the point you were saying just now, I think if I'd stopped pitching at publishers who had not been interested in my earlier games, there would be no one left to pitch to. I mean, that you're going to get far more rejections when you're going through the pitching process, even with the best game in the world, than you are going to get accepted, because
Yeah.
that's just how the thing works. And I think regardless of whether you've been turned away for a good reason, like it's not your genre, it's not the type of game that you're kind of used to publishing, or whether it's bad reasons, like they just don't like the game, those things change the next time you are pitching another game, because invariably the game is either different, or the publisher has changed, or you as a developer have changed, and you can fill in some of the gaps that the publisher kind of doesn't feel they could have done. So I think all of those things kind of contribute to a kind of that relationship evolves from, I would have probably been, even though we've known each other and would have interacted in between, I probably felt more comfortable pitching you this, having talked to you about Rico, and you turn
Yeah.
that down, because at that point I'm in a position where I understood the reason why you rejected Rico, and then understood more how this is a better fit for you.
Yeah.
Kind of going forward. So I was much more confident going, right, this actually is the sort of game Paul likes or is able to publish. So he's a very obvious and immediate kind of target for me.
Yeah, and it definitely felt, the pitch you sent me was quite specific to me, and it was, even down to sort of details and budget of things that I talked about with you before. And that's sort of, that will always get a publisher's attention if you have that. I mean, it's difficult. People really will often say, oh, what budget can you do specifically? And it's sort of, it does vary a lot, because people change their risk strategy over time, or they have more cash over time or less cash over time. The budgets you can do might vary depending on if you have 4 projects signed in 1 year or 8 projects signed in 1 year, if you're a big publisher. I mean, I do one thing at a time, really, sometimes 2. So it's kind of that affects my budget ranges and things that I could potentially do and risks I potentially take. And also people are kind of actively trying to make decisions the whole time anyway. Just because someone hasn't done something in the past doesn't mean they won't in future. So that's where all that relationship stuff comes in, is sort of, you can look at someone else's business and go, does that suit what they're trying to do, or what they might be trying to do? And another aspect of this was you and your studio have a background in doing multi-platform, and that, especially in the kind of current climate of the way the games market is, being able to have something that's a good concept and say, okay, well, we can just take it out to all these places. You're not going to have to bring in this additional structure and unknown costs and other things to do that. That was really, really compelling for me. Is that something you've kind of consciously built up within the studio as something you can offer, or is it just happen to be the collection of skills that you've got right now?
No, I think certainly for me personally, when I started Ground Shatter, I wanted to be a kind of console first studio, because that was my experience commercially and as a player, that I much prefer playing on the PlayStation than I do on my PC, because it's in my front room and I can sit on the sofa and have a beer and whatever. But yeah, so when I started Ground Shatter kind of 6 years ago, it was just at that time it was possible to get onto those platforms as a independent developer and as a solo developer, as I was at the time. So virtually the first thing I did was get signed up to Sony's as a registered developer for PlayStation 4, and get the hardware and get all the things sorted out for that, because that was a differentiating factor for Skyscrapers, which was our first game, that it was coming out on Steam, which at that point was hard to make a big breakthrough in.
Yes.
Whereas PS4 was less saturated with content, so that was a more obvious target platform. Whereas now PS4 is very hard to get visibility in, and people are moving in other ways. So we've kind of evolved as a studio to encompass as many platforms as we can, and as many platforms as makes sense, just because kind of that's it, in the DNA of the company. And once you've started doing that, then you have a useful bit of knowledge that you can use to help out other people. So I've done a few ports of games like Dead End Job and Binaries and Chime Sharp and things for other companies that have helped maintain that knowledge for me, but also help them get out onto more platforms. So when it comes to our own things, that we're much more control of our own destiny. And like you say, we can go to publishers and say, this game is coming out on everything, and you don't need to find someone else to do the porting work, because we will bear that in mind from the start.
Yeah, no, that's great, and it is something that I think developing those technical skills, and it's another area where studios often see contract work as something that they don't want to be doing, that just pays the bills between doing original IP stuff. But if you have a portfolio, if people trust you to do console work, specifically porting, if you're then coming and saying like, okay, this is going to be multi-platform, to someone like me, immediately that's like, well, people have literally paid you to do just that for them. So I'm assuming that you can do that well, and I've seen the results that you've created with that, and heard that people are happy with it. So it's another thing that kind of adds to your CV as a developer, really, and can be quite useful to do. It is building value as you do the work for hire stuff, I think. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think time has moved on again, and that is there's other people who have done that now. There's plenty of other studios who've seen that same opportunity and that same possibility, and who've done the same thing. So it's probably not as much of a differentiating factor as it was back then. So it's kind of but as an example of one, it's quite good, and other people will find their own kind of niches or ways to prove their value above and beyond what they're specifically doing right now.
Yeah. If you had the financial resources to self-publish this game, do you think you would have done that at the time, or would you have wanted to work with a publisher for all the other functions that a publisher does?
Yeah, I think if I had the resources and I also had the choice, I would probably still go with a publisher,
right?
Because there is a set of things that publishers do that are not the things that I'm particularly strong at or particularly enjoy doing. So whilst self-publishing is kind of, there's a scale of game for which it doesn't really matter. And then once you get beyond that, having someone who has got the right contacts or the right reach, or both in terms of platforms and PR and marketing and press and influencers and all of those things, people who spend their lives kind of doing that, making those connections and building on their kind of publishing chops, are going to be way ahead of someone like me who is spending the majority of the time developing. And then if we're self-publishing, then you also have to find time to do all of those other things that you're asking someone else to do full time. So it's kind of quite a hard, it's a hard ask. If you're looking for a game to be big and be successful, then you need someone who can spend enough time pushing it out there. And for a small studio, I think that's very hard to do alongside everything else.
The other thing that I should mention with this as well is sort of on getting that pitch, I also thought this is something where I can really add value to the whole project, not just sort of, you're going to give me a thing and I'm going to market that thing. It's because I've worked on similar games in the past in a development capacity as well. I can look at it and go, players probably won't respond well to this, or they will to this, or we can bring out this element more, we can bring out that element more. And then that feeds through into the marketing as well. So I think when you're pitching, if you really can see that value that someone's going to add, like right through the product, that they might be able to make a kind of material difference to the outcome, not just by putting money in or by running a kind of marketing process on it, but by actually helping, it can be quite good. And that's attractive sort of from my side as well, because you want to say like, oh, okay, maybe there are some things I can change. There are some pitfalls that could be avoided, or there are some suggestions I could make that might be useful.
Yeah, that classic Dragon's Den thing of you're not just asking for money, you're asking for expertise and knowledge, and going with someone who has done similar games before is so obviously valuable from a PR perspective, if nothing else, but also from a knowledge, and you know how to ask the questions that are pertinent to what we're doing.
I'm glad you said that.
You can say this bit's not working for this reason, and those things. So it's kind of having someone who's got that domain knowledge of the sort of game we're trying to make is invaluable.
Yeah, and sort of it's easier for me when I give feedback on things. I kind of will try and frame it as, here's what the issue I'm having is as well defined as I can, and here's why that might be, and then here's something that you could try, and never like, this is bad, here's the solution, because I think that's the tendency that you can get into, or even just, this is bad, here's no suggested solution. If you don't know a genre, or you don't sort of know how development works, I think that kind of publisher feedback can be a bit problematic at times. I've certainly heard people who've had bad experiences with that.
Yeah, definitely. In the old days when I was working for bigger companies that published, the external producers would often be coming in, and they would get so invested in their own solutions to the problems that they had perceived that even if a better solution came along, then they would be, well, actually, I think my idea is better, rather than what is right for the game.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a tricky thing to get. I'd much rather work with someone who was able to kind of to work around a problem because they are deep enough into a game or a genre to understand that problem and all the kind of directions it could possibly go in.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so we'll probably wrap this up fairly soon, but I wanted to just ask, from your experience of pitching lots of different projects, are there any kind of general things that you could draw out of that, particularly to someone who might be starting or has an early stage company and is trying to get games signed? Like, are there any sort of things that you've learned along the way?
So I think this project in particular was rare for several reasons. Pitching wise, it was signed incredibly quickly, wasn't it? Like in terms. So I sent the DM that I sent you the year before was sort of a teaser, I suppose.
Mm.
And then when we actually started talking about it, it was like between a Wednesday night and a Saturday of the same week over Resd was like almost the limit of
that was the whole pitch and
the kind of
negotiation process. Yeah.
Which is obviously that's really helped by you working in a very small team. So
Yes.
there's not layers of management and
Right.
money people and things to agree. So we were incredibly lucky from that regard that I was looking to sign something quickly. You were able to sign something quickly, and that kind of was a good synergy. And also, it was effectively it was signed off paper, wasn't it? It was a video and a pitch, and that is something you can really probably these days only get away with if you've got a bit of a track record.
Yeah, and the existing relationship. Like,
yeah.
I would never sign anything like that with someone who had never finished a game before, or was not like you. I mean, even before Ground Shatter, like, you're experienced in your career. You've been involved with a lot of different titles and in different situations and so on. So yeah, that would normally I would always insist on some kind of playable something with some final target art, and in this we didn't have either, so it was a risk. Definitely was a risk, but then for me it was kind of when an opportunity is clear and the parameters of it are clear, and obviously the budget and sort of development stuff that you'd proposed really helped with that. So for me it was kind of looking at it and going, I know James can execute things well, I know James is a talented person who's creative, so here I've got something that's definitely going to be finished. It's definitely going to be interesting, and it's going to come in at like the right size and shape to be something I can do something with. So if I can get hold of that now, that's great for me, and that's why I moved on it so quickly. So yeah, that isn't necessarily the greatest example for everyone, but it's about how can you get yourself into the position where that would be true. I think is an interesting thing to think about.
And I think more generally, the kind of tips that I always give people are cast your net wide, but do it meaningfully.
Yeah.
So people have lists of publishers out there that you can scroll down, and you could send a blanket email to all of those people on that list, and that would probably be the wrong approach. You're better off choosing the best 15 or 20 entries on that list, the ones that most closely suit you, and targeting your pitches at those people first. At the very least, choose your favorites, decide who you would like to be published by in your ideal world, and invest in those people first, because whether that's in terms of invest in rewriting the pitch specifically for them, or invest your time in meeting them ahead of time and finding out what they're interested in, those kinds of things. It's always worth doing your research and kind of putting time into preparing those approaches properly if they're publishers that you really care about. And then I guess over time you can widen that net to, if you're unsuccessful, to the more kind of edge cases for you that are big punts or whatever, and you may just get lucky from that. And don't get disheartened, because it's very easy to see rejections as big personal attacks, and almost all of the time rejections are practical things. People don't have the right slots in terms of budget or time scale or genre, or there's so many things going on behind the scenes that you will never know about.
Absolutely.
So when someone rejects you, it could just be that the head of publishing has just changed, and therefore they're not signing anything for 3 months while they hire someone new. And you may know that, you won't know that because it's probably shareholders that haven't been told that yet. So there's all these things that can happen. And then if you're still pitching it 6 months later, it's probably worth trying again. That people are not, as long as you're not relentlessly bombarding people with follow-ups to say, have you seen it yet? Have you seen it yet? If you're a few months later and you think the situation might have changed or the game has changed, it's worth trying again, because the person who said no 6 months ago might go, actually, this is a better fit for us now. I think that's probably a point, and I don't know what that point is, where you have to give up or decide to self-publish or shelve it while you do something else and establish yourself in another way, and then come back to it if that's really that's the thing you want to want to push. I just think it's if you're making games as a kind of commercial entity and having a publishing deal is your approach to things, you've got to understand that if you can't find a publisher who's interested in your game, it's probably because they can't see a market for it, and therefore it's unlikely that there's going to be a market for it.
Yeah.
And then there will be countless examples where I'm wrong on that, where someone will come up with something brand new and it'll be amazing, it'll do really well. But probably those things didn't find publishers, and they just did well of their own accord anyway, if they were kind of the rare diamond type.
Yeah,
games.
there must be some cases of that. I think it's fairly rare that something doesn't get over the starting line with a publisher that's fundamentally interesting, or sort of with all publishers. If you took a song look at every publisher, like I think most games that can get an audience will get at least a kind of, hey, let's talk about this kind of response, or the publisher want to explore something about it, because it has to be sort of attention grabbing in some way, and that's kind of I'm going to talk just quickly about the things I look for generally, which people still seem to struggle with. Some developers still seem to struggle with this. It really is that combination of, there are so many cliches you can wheel out, and I wheel this one out often. It's attention and retention. So it's is this something that will stand out in the context of a lot of other very noisy things? Is it something that has an impact? And like your game has this built-in impact of fight moves that are essentially animations that can be done in quite a straightforward way, that happen, and they're very visible. So to me, that's a way of like, I can show someone what this game is in a GIF, and it happens, and it's cool, and they'll get involved with it. And then retention is about, is there real meat in the game design? Is there something that someone can start thinking about in an ideal situation? Can they go away from the game and think about it while they're not playing? Can they run scenarios in their head and go, oh, I want to try this, or I want to do that? There's so many games that don't really meet that criterion. There are other things as well where you can see that the game's very based on skill that you can build up over time. So something like Tokyo 42 that we did, that had a nice kind of skill-based combat and movement system where you could, when I played it, I wasn't as good as the developers playing it, who aren't as good as speedrunners playing it. And then you can see that the time investment there comes from skill acquisition. So it's that front-loaded thing of like, oh, I want that. What is that? It's emblematic. It's cool. It's interesting. It's exciting. It's thrilling. It's disturbing. Whatever. And then there's, I can see myself or a player really investing into this, using it as a thing to kind of accompany their life. I mean, that's what games are a lot of the time. It's something that can sit alongside the rest of your life, give you a break, give you a system to put your brain inside that engages with it and just takes you out of those sort of immediate worries and concerns. That's the real value of games. So I always think about things in those terms, and that's why what you presented me with, I could see both sides of that coin very quickly. Of kind of, oh, I can sell this kind of thing, which is always like a publisher instinct that you have, where you're like, if I put this in front of people, they'll say, please take my money. And a lot of people literally do in games, which is nice. But also, does this have integrity? Does it have a real game design? Is it more than just the surface? And it takes a lot of time and experience to come up with pitches and ideas that fulfill those things. And you need to make a lot of games and be involved with making games in order to get there, really. I guess just to wrap up, you're kind of building this track record of action movie-ish things that also have a particular little gameplay twist to them. Was that conscious between Rico and Fights, or was it sort of a bit of a coincidence?
I think that's probably down to kind of my general influences as a person. So I love dumb action films. That's the kind of constant through my life. And I love arcade games, like stand-up kind of arcade games. So Skyscrapers is kind of very obviously that lineage. And then Rico's a sort of throwback to me playing Doom on my PC as a teenager. And then it kind of, I like encapsulating things in from a design perspective into kind of the core of the idea, and then wrapping that up in something that is also kind of cool and outlandish. And then that's kind of true of all of our titles, I suppose. So that's kind of, I don't know if it's a conscious decision, but it's you're right. It's very much how we've gone.
There's something I noticed with Rico, particularly, is that it feels kind of like you remember Doom. It has that thing of, Doom is all about bursting into the room and shooting people, and there's sort of other elements of Doom that you don't have because you've got this really strong refinement. And I think Fights is sort of somewhat similar in that you kind of, when you play a turn, it feels like you've made all these cool decisions sort of very immediately. And I think in other games it's sort of, especially in something like XCOM or one of those more trad turn-based games, it's very like you have to walk up to the person and then you have to, they might be on Overwatch and then you stand there alternately kind of hitting each other like this. Whereas in Fights, it's like you punch the guy, you do this, you do this other thing. So that encapsulation and refinement, I think, seems to be a bit of a trend, and that's definitely appealing when it comes to pitches.
It may just be impatience on my part. I think I like to get to the action very quickly, and I think, like you say, that XCOM thing of waiting a long time before you have the encounter, that's part of what XCOM is about, the kind of inherent tension of that. But I'm not about inherent tension. I'm about the fastest route to smashing a man's head against a thing.
On that note, I think we shall leave it for now. But if you do like this, do all the YouTube things. Leave us some comments if you want us to cover other things in future. What we're hoping to do is talk to other members of the Ground Shatter team, and I'm sure James will be back in future to talk through other things. But for now, goodbye.
Goodbye.